The courtroom was buzzing that morning. Lawyers carried their heavy briefcases, the prosecutor whispered last-minute notes to his team, and the audience murmured while waiting for the judge to arrive. Everything looked ordinary, until the doors, at the back, opened. Everyone turned their heads when they saw him. A boy, hardly 17, walked in with hesitant steps. His suit looked borrowed, the sleeves a little too long and his tie slightly crooked as if he had tied it in a rush. His face was young, almost childlike, but his eyes carried a seriousness far beyond his age. People frowned and whispered. "What's a kid doing here?" someone asked. "Is he lost?" Another chuckled. "This isn't a school tour, boy," a man muttered under his breath. But the boy, Daniel, didn't sit with the audience. He didn't look around nervously like a visitor would. Instead, he walked with quiet determination toward the defense table, the very place reserved for attorneys. A hush spread across the courtroom. Nobody could believe what they were seeing. The bailiff stepped forward quickly. "Son, you can't sit there. That's for legal representatives." Daniel's hands trembled slightly, but he placed a stack of neatly organized papers on the table and lifted his chin. His voice shook, but he managed to speak clearly. "I am here to represent the defendant." Gasps filled the room. The prosecutor's eyebrows shot up, and even the stenographer looked confused. A boy, this young, claiming to defend someone in court? It sounded impossible. At that moment, Judge Harrison entered. He was a tall man with gray hair and a stern presence that silenced the room the second he sat down. Adjusting his glasses, he scanned the courtroom, then froze when he noticed the teenager at the defense table. "What is this?" Judge Harrison's voice thundered. "Why is there a child sitting where a lawyer should be?" Everyone waited for the boy to stammer, to run out of courage and leave. But Daniel didn't move. He placed both hands on the table, trying to hide how they shook. "Your Honor," he said softly, "I am here to defend my brother." The words hit the courtroom like a spark. A low wave of laughter and murmurs swept through the audience. The prosecutor smirked, leaning back in his chair, clearly amused. Some people shook their heads in pity. A boy defending his brother? This had to be a joke. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his expression caught between irritation and disbelief. "Son, this isn't a classroom debate, this is a court of law. Do you even understand where you are standing?" Daniel swallowed hard. His throat was dry, but he nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, I know exactly where I am, and I know what I have to do." The judge raised an eyebrow. His tone turned mocking. "Oh, really? Tell me, young man, do you expect us to believe you're an attorney? Do you even know the first thing about the law?" The audience chuckled again, some covering their mouths to hide their amusement. But Daniel didn't shrink. For a moment, his eyes flickered with the pain of being mocked. But then they steadied. He thought of his brother sitting in chains, his only family left, and the fire in his heart burned stronger than his fear. "With respect, Your Honor," Daniel said, his voice a little louder this time, "I may not wear the title of attorney, but I know the truth, and I will prove it." The laughter died down. People exchanged looks. There was something in the boy's tone, something raw, something determined, that made it hard to dismiss him completely. Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, his mocking smile fading into a frown. For the first time, he realized this boy wasn't simply lost or playing a game. He was serious, dead serious. And in that moment, the courtroom shifted. What began as a joke now carried the weight of a story no one in that room would ever forget. Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses, staring at the boy as if this was some kind of cruel prank. He was a man of 60, known for his sharp tongue and even sharper judgments. He had little patience for nonsense, and to him this was exactly that, nonsense. "Son," he said firmly, leaning forward, "this is a court of law. You don't belong here. Are you trying to waste my time?" The courtroom chuckled at his tone. People whispered again, laughing under their breaths. Some even shook their heads, pitying the boy who had walked into the lion's den. Daniel felt his ears burn with embarrassment. He could feel every eye on him, every mocking look stabbing into his confidence. For a second, he thought about walking out, about admitting that maybe he was too young, too inexperienced, and too foolish. But then he turned his head slightly and saw his brother Michael sitting in chains. Michael's eyes were tired, full of hopelessness, but when he looked at Daniel, there was a faint spark of trust. That single look gave Daniel courage. His brother believed in him even when the world didn't. "No, Your Honor," Daniel replied, his voice steady though his hands still trembled. "I'm not wasting your time. I am here to defend my brother, because no one else will." The courtroom went silent again. For a moment, Judge Harrison was caught off guard, but instead of softening, he laughed. His deep voice echoed across the walls. "Defend your brother?" he repeated with disbelief. "And where exactly did you study law, young man? At your high school debate club?" Laughter rippled through the audience again. The prosecutor smirked openly, whispering something to his assistant, who also laughed. Even the court clerk smiled faintly, trying to hide it behind her hand. Daniel's cheeks flushed, but he stood his ground. "I studied wherever I could, Your Honor. Books, lectures, case files, anywhere I could find knowledge. I may not be an attorney, but I know enough to prove the truth." Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, unimpressed. "You think this is a game? Do you realize what's at stake here? Your brother could go to prison for years. This is not some fairy tale where a boy can march in and play lawyer." "I know it's not a game," Daniel said quickly, his voice breaking slightly. "I know it better than anyone, because if my brother goes to prison, I'll lose the only family I have left. And I can't let that happen." The judge froze for a brief second. His eyes softened, though only slightly. "Still," he shook his head, "you're a child. This is ridiculous." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I may be young, but I'm not a child anymore. My brother raised me after our parents died. He sacrificed everything for me. If I don't stand up for him now, then all his sacrifices mean nothing." The silence in the room grew heavier. People were no longer laughing as freely. Some whispered less mockingly now, realizing the weight behind the boy's words. The sincerity in Daniel's tone could not be ignored, but Judge Harrison wasn't ready to surrender. His pride, his authority, and the rules of the court stood in the way. He slammed his gavel down once. "This is irregular, unacceptable, and frankly insulting to this court. The law is not a place for children to play hero." Daniel flinched at the sound but did not sit down. Instead, he lifted one of the thick books he had brought. Its pages were worn and full of notes. He opened it and began to read aloud, his voice trembling at first, then growing stronger. "According to section—" He paused, steadying his breath. "A defendant has the right to representation, and when no legal counsel is available, they have the right to speak in their own defense or for a family member to speak on their behalf. That's not me making it up. That's the law." Judge Harrison stared at him. The laughter in the room died instantly. The boy had not only stood his ground but had cited the law itself. The courtroom was no longer amused. For the first time that morning, Daniel saw something different in the judge's eyes. Not just irritation, but curiosity. The boy who was mocked as a foolish child had just made the entire room pause. And deep down, Judge Harrison realized this boy might not be ordinary at all. Daniel's voice echoed in the silent courtroom, but inside his chest his heart was pounding hard. He had never stood in a place like this before. Every word felt heavy. Every sentence felt like a mountain he had to climb. But he knew he couldn't stop. His brother's future depended on him. Michael sat quietly in chains beside him. His head was lowered, his hair unkempt, his face pale, with exhaustion. To the court, he looked like just another accused man. But to Daniel, he was everything. His brother, his father figure, his protector. Daniel's thoughts drifted back to their childhood, memories flashing before his eyes like fragments of a broken film reel. He remembered the night everything changed. Their parents had gone out one rainy evening and never came back. A terrible car crash had taken them away, leaving the two brothers alone in a world that suddenly felt cold and merciless. Daniel had been only 10 at the time. He remembered sitting in the hospital corridor, too small to understand death, too scared to ask questions. It was Michael, just 18 then, who took his little hand and whispered, "Don't cry, Danny. I'll take care of you. I promise." And he had kept that promise. Michael gave up his chance to go to college. He stopped dreaming about his own future and instead worked 2 jobs, day shifts in a factory, night shifts washing dishes at a diner. His hands blistered, his body grew thin, but he never complained. Every time Daniel needed school supplies, Michael found a way. When Daniel was hungry, Michael skipped meals so he could eat. When Daniel was sick, Michael stayed up all night watching over him. To the world, Michael was just another struggling young man. To Daniel, he was a hero. Now that hero sat accused of a crime he didn't commit. Michael had been framed for theft at his workplace, accused of stealing equipment worth thousands of dollars. The evidence seemed stacked against him, documents with his name, a witness who claimed to see him near the storage room. But Daniel knew his brother too well. Michael was not a thief. He would never betray the values their parents taught them. Daniel had spent weeks preparing. He couldn't afford a lawyer. Every law firm they approached either laughed at them or demanded money they didn't have. So Daniel took it upon himself. He borrowed books from the library, studied every case he could find, and stayed up late reading online lectures. His young mind absorbed the information like a sponge. He wrote notes until his hands cramped, practiced arguments in front of a cracked mirror, and memorized legal terms until they felt natural on his tongue. It wasn't easy. He was ridiculed by neighbors, ignored by adults, and even Michael begged him to stop. "Danny, you're just a kid," Michael had said one night, his tired eyes filled with sadness. "I can't let you throw yourself into this, you'll get hurt." But Daniel had shaken his head firmly. "You never gave up on me, Michael. I won't give up on you. If no one believes in you, then I will. Always." And that was why he stood in court today, facing a mocking judge, a smirking prosecutor, and a room full of doubters. He wasn't just defending Michael from prison. He was defending the bond that had kept them alive all these years. As Daniel looked at his brother's tired face, his chest tightened. He remembered every sacrifice, every meal Michael had skipped, every time he had carried the weight of the world so Daniel could smile. That pain, that love, was what fueled his courage. The courtroom might see a nervous teenager in an oversized suit. But Daniel wasn't just a boy. He was a brother, a survivor, and today, he was the only shield standing between his brother and injustice. The pain behind the suit wasn't visible to everyone, but for Daniel, it was the very reason he would not give up, no matter how much. He was mocked, no matter how impossible it seemed. And for the first time, some people in the courtroom began to see it too. The prosecutor leaned back in his chair, smiling with arrogance. He had seen hundreds of cases, faced dozens of defense attorneys, and crushed many of them with ease. To him, this was already won. A teenager standing at the defense table? That was laughable. He rose from his seat, straightening his polished suit, and began to address the court. "Your Honor, this case is very simple. The defendant, Michael Reed, was caught stealing from his workplace. We have signed records showing the missing items under his responsibility. We have a witness who swears they saw him near the storage room. The evidence is undeniable." He spoke with confidence, throwing sharp glances at Daniel as if daring him to respond. The audience nodded, whispering agreement. To them, it looked like Michael's fate was sealed. But Daniel stood up slowly, holding his notes. His hands shook a little, but his voice carried across the room. "Your Honor, may I respond?" Judge Harrison gave him a sharp look. "This should be interesting," he muttered. "Go ahead, boy. Let's see what you think you know." Daniel walked to the center, his steps awkward but determined. He faced the jury, his young face pale but his eyes burning with determination. "The prosecutor says the evidence is undeniable," he began. "But evidence can be misleading when it is not examined carefully. And witnesses can lie." The room shifted. A few eyebrows raised. The boy's words, though spoken softly, carried weight. Daniel held up a copy of the signed records. These papers claim my brother was responsible for the stolen items, but look closely. His signature here is different from his actual handwriting. I compared it with dozens of forms he filled at work. The strokes are uneven, the letters shaped differently. This isn't his writing. This is forgery. Murmurs spread through the audience. The prosecutor frowned, leaning forward, surprised that the boy had even noticed such details. Daniel turned to the so-called witness. You said you saw my brother near the storage room at 9 o'clock, correct? The witness nodded, looking confident. Daniel took a deep breath, pulling out a piece of paper. Then how do you explain this? My brother was clocked into his shift at the factory across town at that exact time. I obtained the timesheet. Gasps filled the courtroom. The witness stiffened, his face turning pale. The prosecutor stood, quickly, objecting. This is outrageous! This boy cannot present evidence like this! But Judge Harrison raised a hand, his eyes narrowing. On the contrary, counselor, if the evidence is real, it must be heard. The prosecutor swallowed hard, his confidence shaken. Daniel's voice grew steadier now, his nerves melting into focus. My brother has worked himself to the bone to support me. He doesn't have time for lies, and he doesn't have the heart for stealing. He is not guilty. He is a victim of someone else's crime. The room fell silent. The laughter, the whispers, the mocking smiles, all of it had vanished. Now every person in the courtroom was listening. Even Judge Harrison, who had ridiculed Daniel earlier, leaned forward with genuine interest. For the first time, he wasn't looking at a boy. He was looking at someone who spoke with truth, with courage, and with surprising knowledge of the law. The prosecutor tried to interrupt again, but his voice no longer carried the same strength. His face was red, his posture stiff. The confidence he once had was crumbling in the face of a teenager who refused to back down. Daniel closed his folder and looked straight at the jury. His voice cracked slightly, but his words struck deep. You laughed at me when I stood here. You thought I was just a boy. Maybe I am. But the truth doesn't need age. It only needs courage to be spoken. And I will speak it, no matter how many people doubt me. The silence that followed was powerful. The boy who had been mocked and ridiculed had just commanded the attention of an entire courtroom. And slowly, even Judge Harrison felt something stir in his heart. A respect he had not expected to feel that morning. Daniel stood in the center of the courtroom, his papers shaking slightly in his hands. He had just finished tearing holes in the prosecution's evidence, but now came the hardest part, the closing words. He knew that facts could win minds, but only emotions could reach hearts. And today, he needed both. He turned slowly toward the jury, his young face pale, his lips trembling, but his eyes filled with determination. The silence in the room was heavy, as though everyone was holding their breath, waiting to hear what he would say. My brother, Daniel began softly, is not just a defendant. He is not just a man sitting in chains. He is the reason I am alive today. A hush spread across the courtroom. The words struck deep because they carried the weight of truth. Daniel's voice wavered as he continued. When our parents died, I was only 10 years old. I was scared. I didn't know how to survive, but my brother stepped in. He was barely an adult himself, but he became my father, my mother, and my protector all in one. His throat tightened and tears gathered in his eyes. He wiped them quickly, but his voice cracked anyway. Do you know what it's like to see someone work until their hands bleed, just so you can have food on your plate? Do you know what it's like to see someone give up their dreams, their youth, their freedom, so that you can still smile? The jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some lowered their eyes, others clenched their hands, visibly moved by his words. Even members of the audience dabbed at their eyes with tissues. Daniel's tears finally slipped down his cheeks, but he didn't stop. He stepped closer to the jury box, his young voice shaking with passion. My brother skipped meals so I could eat. He worked day and night so I could stay in school. When I cried at night, he told me stories until I fell asleep. When I was sick, he sat by my bed for hours without rest. Everything I am today, everything I hope to become, is because of him. His breathing grew heavy as he tried to steady himself. And now, they want to take him away from me. They want to lock up the only person who has ever truly cared for me. But he is not a thief. He is not a liar. He is the best man I know. If you take him away, you are not just punishing him. You are punishing me. You are punishing the love that held us together when the world abandoned us. A sob escaped his lips, raw and unfiltered. The courtroom was silent except for the quiet sound of Daniel's crying. For a moment, he struggled to continue, gripping the table for support. Then he looked up again, his eyes red but burning with desperate sincerity. "Please," he whispered, his voice breaking completely. "Please don't take my brother away from me. He is all I have. Without him, I have nothing." The words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. A few jurors had tears in their eyes. The once confident prosecutor now looked down, ashamed to even meet the boy's gaze. Judge Harrison, who had mocked Daniel earlier, sat frozen. His throat tightened, his chest heavy. In his decades of service, he had seen hardened criminals and cunning lawyers, but he had never seen anything like this. An untrained boy standing in the face of ridicule and despair, speaking with the kind of honesty no law book could teach. Daniel slowly sat down, his body shaking, his face wet with tears. Michael reached out, placing his chained hands gently on his brother's shoulder. "Danny," he whispered, his voice broken with emotion. "You've done enough. No matter what happens, I'm proud of you." But the courtroom was not the same anymore. Something had shifted. The laughter that had once filled the air was gone. Now, all that remained was silence. Silence filled with respect, sorrow, and the undeniable power of love. The courtroom was silent. The kind of silence that carries weight, the kind that presses against the walls and makes every breath feel heavy. Daniel sat back down, wiping his tears while Michael gently patted his shoulder with his chained hands. The boy had poured out his soul in front of everyone. Now, all eyes turned to Judge Harrison. The judge leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together. He had been on the bench for more than 30 years. He had seen liars, manipulators, smooth-talking lawyers who could twist words like a sword. But this was different. In front of him sat a teenager who had no training, no license, and no polished skills. Yet, the boy had managed to shake the entire courtroom with nothing but truth and raw love. For a moment, Judge Harrison remembered his own youth. He had grown up poor, raised by a single mother who worked long hours to keep food on the table. He remembered nights when she came home exhausted, hands blistered from cleaning houses. He remembered the promises he made to himself, as a child, that one day he would rise high enough to protect people like her. But somewhere along the way, in the cold halls of law and justice, he had forgotten that promise. And now, this boy, this Daniel, had reminded him. The judge cleared his throat, but his voice did not carry its usual sharpness. It was softer, almost uncertain. "Mr. Reed," he said, looking at Daniel, "you have surprised this court today. I did not expect someone of your age to speak with such clarity and heart." Daniel looked up nervously, not sure if this was another insult or genuine. The judge's eyes, however, no longer carried mockery. They carried something else. Respect. Judge Harrison turned his gaze toward the prosecutor. "Counsel, the defense has presented some troubling inconsistencies, forged signatures, contradictory time records, a witness whose story now appears questionable. Do you have a response?" The prosecutor stood, his face red, his voice trembling slightly. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is highly irregular. That boy should not even be allowed to stand in this courtroom. He is not a lawyer." The judge's eyes hardened. Irregular or not, facts remain facts. Are you denying the evidence he presented? The prosecutor stuttered, flipping through his papers. I need more time to review. Enough. The judge cut him off firmly, slamming his gavel once. The sound rang through the room. Justice is not about pride. It is about truth. And right now, this boy has revealed more truth than you. Counselor. Gasps echoed around the courtroom. Daniel's heart skipped. Was this really happening? Judge Harrison turned to the jury, his tone calmer now. You have heard the words of this young man. You have seen the cracks in the evidence. It is your duty to weigh not just the papers placed before you, but also the sincerity, the logic, and the undeniable humanity that has been shown today. He paused, then looked back at Daniel. His voice softened. Young man, you may not yet be an attorney by the rules of the bar, but in spirit you have shown what it truly means to fight for justice. Daniel's chest tightened. Tears threatened to return, but this time they were not from fear. They were from relief. For the first time, someone in power was not mocking him. Someone was finally listening. Michael, sitting in chains, couldn't hold back his own tears. He whispered, Danny, you did it. You really did it. The judge took a deep breath. His voice, though steady, carried emotion now. The court will take a brief recess before the verdict. But let me say this before we break. Daniel Reed, you reminded me today why this court exists. Not to punish blindly, not to mock, but to seek the truth. And for that, I thank you. The courtroom stirred with emotion. People who once laughed at Daniel now looked at him with admiration. Even strangers in the gallery wiped their eyes. A boy who had been mocked as a fool had just touched the heart of a judge and shifted the balance of an entire trial. For Daniel, it was no longer about winning or losing. It was about being heard. And finally, at last, his voice had broken through. The courtroom reconvened after the short recess. Everyone sat quietly, waiting for the final decision. The air was heavy with anticipation. Some jurors still looked shaken by Daniel's emotional plea. Others avoided meeting his eyes as though they didn't want to reveal their sympathy too soon. Daniel sat beside his brother, his hands clasped tightly together. His palms were sweaty, and his chest rose and fell quickly with nervous breaths. He had done everything he could, presented evidence, challenged the witness, poured out his heart. Now the decision was no longer his. Michael leaned closer, his chained hands brushing against Daniel's arm. Danny, he whispered softly. No matter what happens, you've already saved me. You showed the world who I really am. I'm proud of you. Tears stung Daniel's eyes, but he nodded silently. All he wanted was to keep his brother safe. Finally, the jury returned. The foreman stood, holding a slip of paper. The entire room seemed to lean forward, straining to hear the words that would decide everything. We, the jury, the foreman began, his voice steady, find the defendant, Michael Reed, not guilty. For a moment there was silence. It was as if time had frozen. Then the words sank in, and the courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, and even claps broke out in the audience. Michael's head dropped into his hands as tears flowed freely down his face. Daniel stood frozen, unable to believe what he had just heard. The bailiff quickly removed Michael's handcuffs. The sound of the chains falling onto the table was like music to Daniel's ears. Michael stood and immediately pulled his little brother into his arms. Daniel's face pressed against his brother's chest, his tears soaking into Michael's shirt. We did it, Danny, Michael whispered, his voice breaking. We finally did it. Daniel sobbed into his brother's embrace. I told you I wouldn't let them take you, I promised. The sight was so raw, so full of love that even strangers in the courtroom wiped their eyes. A mother in the audience hugged her child closer. A man in the back shook his head in disbelief, whispering to himself, that boy, he saved him. Judge Harrison tapped his gavel, though not harshly. The room quieted again. He looked directly at Daniel, his voice softer than anyone had ever heard before. Daniel Reed, he said, step forward. Daniel hesitated, then slowly walked to the front. His legs felt heavy, but his heart pounded with pride and relief. The judge studied him for a long moment, his stern face now filled with something entirely different. Admiration. "Son," he began, "this morning I mocked you. I laughed at the idea that a teenager could stand in this courtroom and defend a man accused of a crime. But you have proved me wrong. You showed courage, intelligence, and above all, love." Daniel's throat tightened as he listened. The judge continued, "I have been in law for decades, but today you reminded me of something I had forgotten. That justice is not about power or position. It is about truth, spoken with heart. And you, Daniel, have done more for that truth today than many trained lawyers I have seen." The courtroom was silent, hanging on every word. "You may not have the title of attorney yet," the judge said firmly, "but mark my words, you will. And when you do, you will be one of the finest this country has ever seen." The audience burst into applause. Even the prosecutor, though humiliated, lowered his eyes in quiet acknowledgement. Daniel's face burned with emotion. He bowed his head respectfully. "Thank you, Your Honor," he whispered, his voice cracking. Michael stepped forward, pulling his brother close again. "Danny," he said softly, "you're my hero." As the two brothers walked out of the courtroom together, no longer with chains, no longer with fear, people turned to watch them. Strangers nodded, some even clapped as they passed. A boy who had entered as a laughingstock now left as a symbol of courage. Outside, the sun was shining, warm and bright. Daniel looked at his brother and smiled through his tears. "We're free now, Michael. Both of us." Michael ruffled his little brother's hair, his own eyes wet. "Yes, Danny. And one day when you become the lawyer you're meant to be, I'll be the one sitting in the front row cheering the loudest." For the first time in a long time, Daniel felt hope. The fight was over. Justice had been served, and the bond between two brothers had not only saved a life, it had moved an entire court and reminded them all of the true meaning of love and truth.